And welcome back. This week, we're focusing on television and its relationship to Asian American and Latina and Latino popular cultures. So we're thinking not just about Asian Americans and Latinos making television, but also these two groups on television and how they're represented, as well as how they contribute to the larger cultural industry of television. So for this first lecture, there are three key terms: methodology and its two parts, research questions and research methods. So this is kind of a larger issue, not just for this course, but about thinking about your course of study in general. Methodology. Methodology is, of course, asking critical questions about how we come to know what we know in the different disciplines and interdisciplines. So methodology is made up of two parts. First come motivating research questions, and second come research methods to answer those questions. So research questions basically ask, what do you want to know? And you take that question about your interest a step further and ask, why is recognizing this important? So when you think about it, think about all the different research questions that you could be asking. For example, in your business courses or in your biology and engineering courses, because these issues of methodology apply all across the board. So once you ask those research questions of what do you want to know and why is recognizing this important, there are then research methods specific to each field in order to answer those questions. So here in American Studies, Asian American Studies, and US Latino Studies, there are three methods that we can work with here. If you take the course during the longer semester, there are of course more methods that we could cover. But given the online format and the quick turnaround time, we're going to focus mainly on three. So think about the different scholarly articles that we've gone over the course of the semester. We can break down what they do into very large categories of textual analysis, ethnography, and archival analysis. This range of methods also reflects how American Studies, Asian American Studies, and US Latina and Latino Studies are interdisciplinary fields. So first of all, textual analysis. Textual analysis largely comes from the field of English, where you take a text and you scrutinize it closely. You read it closely, paying attention to its representations and how it communicates those representations, and how those representations relate to the larger cultural milieu that exists around the text. So we can see this in our scholarly articles for the week, in Jennifer Esposito's article on Ugly Betty. In that article, Jennifer Esposito looks at the representation of Betty Suarez and her family, and thinks about how that representation of her as a woman and as a Latina coming out of Queens says a lot about ideology. Our second research method in the course is ethnography. Ethnography largely comes out of fields like anthropology. So ethnography basically involves interacting with everyday people in everyday sites. So this may involve one-on-one interviews, this may involve focus groups, this may involve site observations where you go somewhere and pay attention to the different language and practices and rituals that take place at that site and unpack the cultural meanings that are unspoken but widely understood. So for example, one good example of ethnography that we've gone over is Nancy Wong Yun's article on Asian American actors, where she sits down and actually talks to them and listens to their perspective on their craft. And the third method that we go over in this course is archival analysis. Archival analysis largely comes out of the field of history, right? Archival analysis as in finding the archive and finding the historical record and paying attention to what's being said there in order to reconstruct a historical moment. So a good example of an archival analysis for this week is Cho Noriega's article on looking at the relationship between Chicano civil rights struggles and the development of Chicano television and Chicano cinema. So by paying attention to these different research methods, we can then think about television beyond the representation itself. So, if methodology is made up of two parts, research questions and research methods, we can understand these approaches to popular culture as being methodological concerns, right? Since we're studying popular culture, we can understand this diagram from Wen and Tu's article, and this list from Abel-Payan and Romero's introduction as shaping the types of research questions that we ask. First of all, thinking about the complex relationship between economics, politics, aesthetics, and pleasure, and then paying attention to these material processes of representation, production, and audience. Those shape the sort of questions that we ask and answer in studying popular culture. So, there are two large points that I want to make that carry across all 4 articles for the week. The first is thinking about television beyond the screen itself. While it's very important that we do textual analyses to look at specific representations, if we only focus on the image, we're missing out on the larger cultural field of television. So, thinking about our list of methodological concerns from Abel-Payan and Romero. Of course we're paying attention to representation, because it's rather futile to talk about television without actually watching it. But we can also pay attention to issues of production and really complicate how these television shows get produced. So we can think about, for example, Nancy Young's article on Asian American actors, and how if she focuses on the process of production by talking to the actual actors who are involved, right? So instead of just looking at how their image gets used, she also pays attention to them as actual participants in the production process. We can also think about Chon Noriega's article as he thinks about what sorts of politics are being incorporated in the production process, right? He complicates the extent to which we can understand diversity on television as being a full success of the civil rights movements. And as we think about audience, pay attention. We'll want to go back to those original understandings that we have of the positions taken by the Frankfurt School and British cultural studies in terms of talking about popular culture, right? So go back to week 1. These are from the Henry Jenkins article. In short, the Frankfurt School is really interested in the political economy of the culture industry, right? How the entertainment for the masses comes from the hands of so few who profit the most from it. The Frankfurt School is interested in the culture industry and how they create a mass culture that is mass-produced to be consumed by many, and how that creates a mass subject, right? We all become these sort of passive consumers of whatever the culture industry produces for us. And through that creation of the mass subject, the Frankfurt School is particularly interested in how we all become subjects of ideology, right? We all internalize the dominant ideology that's sent through mass culture. So we can think about this issue as we talk about Jennifer Esposito's article on Ugly Betty. She's very interested in how Ugly Betty, which is celebrated as this resistant sort of text, nonetheless participates in the same racial, gendered, and class ideologies that one might see elsewhere. So in that way, she's really interested in issues of how the audience is being influenced and is also reproducing these dominant ideologies. In terms of British cultural studies, that can be summed up, there's a lot there, but it can be summed up as, instead of the way that the Frankfurt School assumes that we as consumers have no agency, British cultural studies pays attention to how, on the everyday level, we are constantly creating, recreating, and resisting dominant meaning. So whereas the Frankfurt School is very much a top-down model where we are all subjected to power, British cultural studies is more of a bottom-up model of power, where we as consumers have the ability to create our own worlds and are not necessarily entirely victimized by what happens from on high. So in terms of thinking about audience from the British cultural studies approach, we can think about the article by Hiram Perez on Tiger Woods' celebrity image. And keep in mind, this is Tiger Woods from the mid-2000s. So the article was written before the big Tiger Woods controversy. But Perez asks, to what purpose are representations of Tiger Woods being put? So he assumes that there's a lot of meaning being made out of that image. But he also complicates that it's just an advertisement by thinking about the way that it gets picked up by, for example, multiracial advocacy groups, and the way that the image's use also fills it with meaning. So he begins with the assumption that consumers are finding meaning there, and then looks at how the image gets used and consumed as also adding on meaning, right? So it's not just about the production, as it is for the Frankfurt School, but also about its consumption. The second big connection I want to draw across the 4 articles is thinking about television as a cultural form. So thinking very specifically about television representation and the way that that relates to some of our larger themes of the course. You'll recall this diagram, the vertical hierarchy of culture, that looks at the separation of high aesthetic culture that's guarded by cultural gatekeepers and institutions from low popular culture that subdivides into mass culture and grassroots cultural production. And of course, in talking about television, we are, for the most part, talking about issues of mass culture, maybe some middle brow, and the way that television never quite seems to make it to the realm of high aesthetic culture. So, to summarize this diagram, we can think about the relationship between legitimacy and access and accessibility. As legitimacy goes up, access and accessibility goes down. Right? Because as we talk about legitimacy, we're talking about as we see things as more important or significant or telling of our cultural moment and who we are, they become produced by fewer people, right? We think about specialized artists as existing up here. And its accessibility to everyday people goes down, right? Because as something becomes more difficult, it necessarily requires more time and engagement and education. Because we associate, for example, mass culture as requiring very little thought, but also as not being particularly legitimate as an art form. Whereas we can think about abstract installation art as existing within the finest of art museums and representing kind of the highest, most abstract and poorly understood form of art. So, where would you fit television on this diagram? It, of course, depends entirely on the context. And of course, television, particularly today, where it's being celebrated more and more as kind of the predominant way of telling stories, kind of exists all along the spectrum. And we can think about how the 4 different authors take up this relationship of legitimacy and access. For example, in Chon Noriega's article, he talks about how the development of Chicano cinema, right, as an art form, actually began with Chicanos and broadcast television, and how the development of the art form kind of involved beginning with popular culture and moving up. We can talk about Nancy Young's article and how the actors talk about this hierarchy in terms of commercial acting versus television acting versus acting in theater, and how the real struggle is trying to get to that middle ground of acting on television without reproducing dominant racial stereotypes. We can think about it in terms of Jennifer Esposito's article, as she looks at representations on Ugly Betty, and the way that, for example, issues of beauty and femininity relate to these issues of legitimacy and accessibility, right? As one gets classier, one appears to have more financial wealth and appears to be more professional, which is a resource available to fewer and fewer people. And finally, we can think about it in terms of Hiram Perez's article, just even in the fact that he focuses on golf and the way that Tiger Woods' image first became celebrated because he marked the entry of non-white people into golf, which is seen as this highly guarded, highly classed activity. Okay? So, see you in a couple.